Some of you may be new, and some of you have been here a while. We talk a lot about the Unitarian Universalist principles. And there are some ideas, some common consensus on values that we share. And so as I thought about this sermon about I and we, I noticed a couple things. I mean, maybe it was through that lens as I looked at the principles. There are two of our principles that really focus on the individual, to affirm and promote the inherent worth and dignity of every person. And then there's the fifth principle. Within that fifth principle, it says we all have the right of conscience, to decide for ourselves, to look within ourselves, to make our own decisions. And then I looked at the rest of the principles. For instance, our seventh principle, which calls us to affirm and promote respect for the interdependent web of all existence, of which we are a part. And as I looked through, I saw words in our principles like compassion, peace, justice, equity, the democratic process. These seem more communal than the first couple of principles I mentioned, which seem more individualistic. And sometimes I find it difficult to resolve, as I look at all these principles, how they fit together. I find paradoxes inherent in a person focusing on an individual's worth and dignity, or considering the person's right to act on their conscience, while also considering the communal responsibilities of justice, equity, peace, compassion, democracy, respect for the interdependent web. I wonder what you think about that. I realize that many of us value independent thinking, individual achievement, personal ethical reflection, individual theological development. Heck, I'm teaching a course after today's service at 1 o'clock called Building Your Own Theology. I know it's a blatant plug for my class, but we'll look at both the personal and the communal aspects of faith, belief, ethics. I don't think there's anything inherently wrong or problematic with robust individualism. Or maybe there is. You know, lately I've been exposed to the idea that the culture that I live in is a white supremacist culture. In other words, a culture that prizes white culture over indigenous culture, black culture, Eastern culture. Our white culture values a robust affirmation of white cultural ideas, including individualism, with ideas like you need to pull yourself up by your bootstraps. There's something wrong with you if you need to be dependent on someone else. And individual rights must take center stage. I've begun to wonder about the core values our principles express, as interpreted through this white cultural framework. And I find myself thinking about how we, or maybe I should own that, I apply our Unitarian Universalist principles within this white overculture. Last month, I started teaching this Building Your Own Theology class, and you're all welcome to come. Every class is unique and different. But last month, I presented ways to consider one's theological development. One of the theories that I presented was new, was born out of Unitarian Universalist move toward a more communal theological development rather than an individual theological development. Yes, you can see the slide there. The top part of the slide is about an individual theological developmental model. It says taught, bought, and sought. And let me explain those. The way this theory goes, it says in our early childhood we're caught. In other words, we don't have much of a choice. Through our primary relationships, children develop beliefs by getting their needs met or not, through loving care or lack thereof from parents and others in their life. Young children start to develop a lived experience of trust, courage, hope, love. And this is the beginning of their theology, their worldview, their way of living in the world. And as they grow into childhood, they are taught about beliefs, values, ethics by those around them, including churches and other communities, family members. And then, in their adolescence, their theology is bought when they begin to think for themselves. Sometimes figuring out what they believe to be true, which is different from what they were brought up in. And in the end, the fourth is sought, as individuals go on their own spiritual quest for truth, enlightenment, ethics. I think there's some value in this model, but I also think there is more to it. And it made sense to me when the people at Meadville Lombard Theological School came up with this different model. A model based on communal spiritual development. Not me telling you what to believe, but us in community figuring out what we believe and co-creating theology, creating it together. A theology that is wrought through a lifetime in community, with faith being a collaborative venture that both provides a foundation for us beyond these walls and evolves and is strengthened as we continually co-develop it together, creating a shared covenant and common aspects of our faith, things that we commonly believe together, like our Unitarian Universalist principles and sources. Being exposed to this new model a few years ago, and then it was around the same time that my studies into anti-racism, indigenous cultures, white supremacy culture, All this was happening kind of simultaneously in my life. And I began to wonder, am I being called to change my personal theology so that it fits with a communal theology? A community that I choose to be part of, and to incorporate others' ideas, beliefs, ethics into my own so that I can be a more effective force for compassion, justice, peace, equity. And I began to wonder, how can my Unitarian Universalist community be part of making my theology more foundational to how I live my life, and make my theology stronger, more evident in how I see the world and how I live my life? As I continued to think about these questions and wonder, a memory came to the surface. I was on the board of the Mid-America District of the Unitarian Universalist Association. We have regular board meetings, and we discuss budgets and the future of Unitarian Universalists, retreat centers, and whether Unitarian Universalism should be districts or regions. You know, the stuff that church geeks like to talk about. At the end of the meeting, we used a worksheet to assess our process, not our product, not the things that we were deciding to do, but how we went about doing those things. Reviewing the way that we dealt with conflict, or if the handouts we gave one another were clear and helpful. Were all points of view heard? Process. How? And on this worksheet, there was you flipped it over, and on the second page, is what you see on the slide. And I know you may not be able to read all of it, but these are questions about anti-racism, anti-oppression. Now, before we go too much further, I want to say that, while I was in this board meeting, I was serving a Unitarian Universalist congregation. I was pretty secure in my individual spiritual quest, in my view of the world. I believed I was as anti-racist and anti-oppressive as any Unitarian Universalist minister. And that in the past, whenever we used this worksheet, and we flipped it over to this side about anti-racism and anti-oppression, I think everybody in the room felt it was pretty perfunctory. We're not anti-racist. Why should we worry about these things? We don't want to hurt each other. We're going to be very careful with each other. We're all anti-racist and anti-oppressive. And one final piece of our story. We had a new member on the board, a person who was not gender binary. And we had given them, because this was their first meeting, we thought, we'll give them the process observer this thing to do. That way they can see how we work and how we get along with one another, and they can kind of observe the process for us and give us feedback. Great idea. Well, as they gave us feedback, it was not what we expected it to be, that we were all wonderful at being anti-racist and anti-oppressive. She particularly was passionate as she began to discuss question 4. What discussion of issues indicated that the board members are conscious of the systemic power of oppression? she used the pronoun they. And they said that the group, our board, both male and female members, gave disproportionate power to the white male members of the group, deferred to the white male members on big decisions, allowed white male members to interrupt without consequence, backed off ideas that were not affirmed by the white male members, and that when they, this person, the new member, attempted to assert themselves, they felt unsupported and not really listened to. You know, as I heard this, the first thing I experienced was anger. How dare that person accuse me of being anti-racist and being a racist and oppressive? And I didn't do that. I didn't try to hurt anybody. I wasn't being racist. I wasn't oppressive. I was shocked. And then the awareness sunk in that what they were saying was accurate. And I got sick to my stomach. And finally, we, the board, had to work together to try to figure out how to address these issues that we had been completely blind to. How could we forge a new way of seeing the world, each other, and our theology together? This was one of those big aha moments when I realized that my vision alone is not enough, and that I must be open to others that I trust and care about to be part of my spiritual journey as I move from a more individualistic spiritual quest to one that brings others in, that solicits others, that listens to others, so that I am part of a communal spiritual quest. American educator and theologian George Rupp claims, communities of faith have an obligation to stand in opposition to a narrow focus on individual fulfillment, preoccupied with achieving satisfaction for the self, including satisfying relationships as simply a means to an end to benefit the self. Over and against this individualistic orientation, communities of faith must remind us all that we do not begin as separate entities, which then somehow must find some way to be connected. Moving from an I focus to we focus can be challenging, at times intensely uncomfortable, especially for some Unitarian Universalists. You know, we say no dogmas, no creeds. What holds us together is covenants, agreements that we will be with one another, and we will treat each other with kindness and respect and compassion. And we will use a democratic process in our decision-making from governance to worship to our principles. And I wondered at that point, do covenants hold the same importance, the same power, the same spiritual significance as dogmas and creeds? I say they do, if we live them in community with one another and then share what we've learned in the world. The possibilities found in a covenantal we faith community can truly be transformative if we are open to them. and not so worried about making the proclamation of our own individualism be the loudest voice in the room. As Reverend Mark Morrison Reed said, the religious community is essential, for alone our vision is too narrow to see all that must be seen, and our strength too limited to do all that must be done. Together our vision widens and our strength is renewed. I believe strongly that the work of communal spiritual development, developing an anti-racist worldview, and of being a covenantal faith community is what we as Unitarian Universalists aspire to. And we need to understand that this is active work. Active work that's done by doing our own internal spiritual work and sharing that work with one another. In addition to learning the difference between a white supremacist worldview and an anti-racist worldview, and hammering out a covenant about how we want to be as a community. All these interconnect, and they require of us in community to communicate and share our lives with one another. And I thought, how are we doing this now? And I believe we do this in certain ways, and have in many ways in this congregation. But I want us to be more intentional about it. I want us to recognize the ways that we do this. So I want to point out that we have a Decentering Whiteness book club. And we just finished the book, The Sum of Us. Here it is. By Heather McGee. And we are beginning a new book, right here, A Black Woman's History of the United States. We'll begin it in October. I highly recommend both books. And yes, I'm plugging another class here, but the point is that this group of this congregation is delving deeply into identifying and understanding both a white supremacist worldview and how to overcome it. To de-center whiteness in our lives, in our congregation, in our denomination. In the book, The Sum of Us, they talk about what's called a zero-sum game, which essentially boils down to how white supremacy is supported. And it says that if one or more people of color benefit from a program, a law, an activity, a facility, take it away, even if there's a cost to everyone, even if it oppresses and suppresses everyone, and it will continue to oppress and suppress the person or people of color. Many white people see racism as a zero-sum game and blame black and brown people when the American dream is harder to reach. Heather McGee presents in her book this first example, and she presents many examples. But the first one starts in the 1920s. Think about this, the 1920s, and I don't know that many of us were around in the 1920s, but in the 1920s, there were these community pools that were built across the country. Huge, elaborate swimming pools built that for everyone. Anyone could come, they were free, people could enjoy them. And then people of color tried to use these community pools. And the pools were all shut down across the country, bulldozed and forgotten. Heck, I didn't even know they existed until I read this book. And instead, private pools were built in communities they had restricted entry, they cost, you had to pay money to go. And many people, white and people of color, were thus unable to use these pools. Everyone losing out. It was zero sum. And I noticed in the news this week, again and again and again, we hear about restricting voting rights in so many different states. My friends, that too is a zero-sum game. You take away or try to take away the rights of a person or people of color, and it negatively affects everyone. The voting rights of old people, the voting rights of indigenous people, the voting rights. It takes away the rights of everyone. It's zero sum. But the thing is, and I bring this up because I was pretty hopeless in reading through this book that things were going to change. But in Heather McGhee's last chapter, she offered some hope and a process she called about building solidarity. So all rise and benefit. And her ideas resonated with me as I thought about the possibilities of we. She talks about a solidarity dividend. She suggests we begin looking at the benefits of being in and working together as diverse communities. And she talked about how diverse communities working in solidarity tend to be more creative, more efficient, more effective. That they affirm one and all. And when we do this, when we work in solidarity, we affirm that we really do need one another. Everybody benefits. And we also realize that this process of solidarity is built in such a way, it's not a cookie cutter way. It's a not one size fits all kind of way. There's many things we have to do. It needs to be a community where communication of ideas and differences all are expressed and a unique covenant develops. Let's say a unique, effective community develops. She told us one story. I'm close to ending with this. I say it was in this town, Lewiston, Maine. It was an industrial town, and the jobs were leaving. And some of the town's leadership was feeling that the town was going to be lost. And then Somalis moved in, immigrated into this town, filling up the empty businesses and empty homes. And the economy grew. And things began to happen that hadn't happened before. For instance, a Somali couple building a business on making these ethnic clothes for the Somalis in town. Well, they had this young woman, this young white woman came in, unemployed seamstress. And she saw these wonderful clothes and she said, I have this ability, I can be of help. And the couple said, yes, we need you. And they hired her on the spot. And now she has a job. And they're all working together. Now, I'm not saying that everything is great in Maine for people of color, but that town continues to thrive because this attitude of we. So what are the possibilities of we for this Unitarian Universalist congregation of Miami? Well, for Miami itself, I think it could be that we continue to find ways to be in relationship with each other about everything. By Zoom, by person, however you feel comfortable and safe. Let's join in discussions about theology and racism and decentering whiteness and values and our principles, and decide together about what things we are going to covenant together to believe and to do, what our future will be, how we will influence and impact Miami, Florida, and perhaps even the United States. And together, who we are will be forged, strengthened, and empowered, giving us a firm foundation for who the Unitarian Universalist congregation of Miami is, what we together stand for, and what we as a congregation do.